Alright guys, this is our first recorded video lecture for Chapter 2. For finishing up our Econ 150 and 151 review and then Chapter 2. So this video will be based on what I think or what I see usually as the most difficult concepts in Chapter 2. I will not cover all the details that you can easily read about and understand on your own, so that you can continue to do that instead of just relying on these videos completely. Now, if you have questions, please make sure you write them down, and then on Wednesday when we meet again, we will talk about them. Okay. Now, this video, I don't know how long it will take me, but I would suspect it will probably be about an hour. I would encourage you to take breaks if you can't handle watching a lecture that long. That's the advantage of putting this online. So pause it, digest it, think about it, and then come back. And you can do it over several days, since this will be up probably tonight, and then you have Friday through next Wednesday to kind of work on this. Okay, alright, as you can see, I've already shared my screen from where we stopped last during our class yesterday. And yesterday we did the review on the production side theory, which is on the PPF, and how trade works with the constant cost condition, where we had straight lines for our PPFs. Then we started talking about the consumer side, and we talked about, we reviewed utility, marginal utility, diminishing marginal utility, and the budget constraint, what it means, how it works, what shifts it, and etc. And then we stopped with these indifference curves that we introduced. Okay. Now, if you don't remember these topics, I have posted the last video on the channel as well, so go review that. But these indifference curves, like we mentioned, they measure different levels of utility you can get when you consume different quantities of goods. And here we're again just assuming you have only 2 goods to consume, because again, whether it's 2 or 2 million, the principle of how you can choose, and when you want to consume more of one good, you have to give up the consumption of another. Is true, right? Because everybody has a fixed budget. You cannot just consume more of both forever. It just won't happen. So we talked about how the shape of these curves are bowled out toward the origin, because at point A, when we have more gas than pizza, we value pizza a lot more. We're willing to give up a lot more gas for a little bit of pizza, right? And then by the time we get to point B, where we have a lot of pizza and very little gas, you can see that for us to give up a little bit of gas, we have to receive a whole lot of pizza for us to be as happy as before. So any point on the same indifference curve, so A and B are on the same indifference curve of I1, any point on the same curve gives you the same level of a utility, so the same level of satisfaction and happiness. So you're happy with, maybe looks like 50 gallons of gas, and down here, let's say 3 pizzas, right? You're happy, just as happy with those quantities than having maybe 5 gallons of gas and 25 pizzas, right? I'm just making these numbers up, but the point is, okay, when you have 50 gallons of gas and 3 pizzas, you're just as happy as having 5 pizzas and 5 gallons of gas and 25 pizzas. So these different combinations of consumption make you just as happy. Okay, so that's what an indifference curve means, and we said the slope of it is called the marginal rate of substitution, which tells you how much you're willing to give up one good for the consumption of something else. Okay. Now, last time we also said that I2 is a higher level of utility than I1, and then I3 is higher than I2. So as you move out in this direction, we're becoming happier, right? So that's a fundamental assumption in economics, where more is better, right? More consumption makes people happier. When you go out in this direction that I just drew, you can see you're having more gas and more pizza. That's why you're moving up on your utility level to a different indifference curve. Okay. So that's what indifference curves mean. And then let's put the indifference curves together with your budget constraint, right? So if we again look at your consumption of gas, okay, versus pizza. Last time we said, okay, this is your budget constraint, right? It's a straight line, where last time we said at $2 per gallon, your $100 a week income can get you 50 gallons of gas, or it can get you 10 pizzas, because pizzas are 10 bucks each, and you're making $100 a week, so you can get 10. So based on this information, if you have a graph like this, and I give you this line, and I tell you, okay, here are the numbers, and you know that pizza is $10 each, you should then be able to figure out, okay, my income must be 100, right? Because at this point, when I'm buying 10 pizzas at $10 each, I'm buying 0 gallons of gas. So that means I'm spending all my money on pizza. So I must only have $100, right? And then if I were to go one step further and ask you, well, what is the price of gas? You can say, okay, well, the same $100 I just figured out can buy me 50 gallons of gas, so gas must be $2, right? So you can work backwards based on what we introduced last time, okay? Now, so this is your budget constraint, okay? What if, let me change it to a different color, we have some indifference curves we put in here. So indifference curves are always, in this shape, and they're always kind of parallel to each other. They never touch. Okay, and if I still have these three indifference curves like this, okay, now pretend here it didn't really cross, it just light tangent right here at this point. Okay, now where is my optimal consumption? Well, my optimal consumption, again, we said, is the highest utility you can reach, right? So that means among all these different utility curves, there should be an infinite number of parallel ones, not just these three. I just arbitrarily found three to show you. But your optimal consumption is where your budget can give you the highest level of utility. And you can see it is then this point where, let's call this point A, this tangent point, when one of the indifference curves lies tangent to your budget constraint, right? Because you can look at other points like, let's call this point B, this point C. So A, B, and C are all on your budget constraint. That means A, B, and C are three options that will all cost you your entire $100 of income. Okay, all three will cost you $100, but A is better because B and C are on a lower level of utility than A. So if you're spending $100 anyway, you might as well be as happy as you can be, right? So that's the assumption. So A here, let's say at A looks like it's about, 25 gallons of gas and 5 pizzas, right? So A here then is your optimal consumption because this is the highest utility you can get when you spend your $100. Okay, anywhere else your utility is not going to be this high, because if your utility gets any higher, it's going to be above I2, which means it doesn't touch your budget constraint. So that's a level of utility you cannot afford. Anything lower than I2 then gives you this B and C situation where you're spending just as much money, but you're on a lower level of utility, right? And last time we said your optimal consumption happens when your marginal utility per dollar, in this case of gas, okay, equals marginal utility per dollar of pizza, okay, and that is true at point A. Okay, so point A is the graphical representation of this condition of the optimal consumption we talked about last time. Okay? All right, so that concludes our discussion on the consumption side, and I mentioned last time that I expect you to know the supply and demand model fairly well, right? How does the demand work, and what's the difference between a demand curve and demand schedule, and how do you find the equilibrium, and how do you tell how the supply works, and etc. That one, I feel like you should have a much better understanding being in a 300 level class. Now, if you do have questions, again, please write it down, and let's talk about it next time. Okay. Now, also, there's some fundamentals about comparative advantage and where where you can get it from, or how it benefits trade and etc. Those are things that I also expect you to know. Okay. Now let's move on to chapter number 2. Okay. So chapter number 2 is what this video was initially intended, but since we didn't finish that little bit of the review, that's what we just did. Okay. So chapter number 2 kind of talks about these different principles about comparative advantage and international trade and etc. Okay, so let's look at how the trade theories on comparative advantage came along, right? And now again, I'm not going to address every single question on your chapter summary list that I gave you, and I hope you already did those before you viewed these videos. So I will address the harder ones here, and make sure you can answer all of these on your own, though. Okay. Now, question number 1 is not hard by any means. Okay, but I do want to talk about the historical background of how comparative advantage came along, right? And in the 1600s and before, for several hundred years, the world kind of held on to this belief called mercantilism for trade. Mercantilism is kind of interesting, where countries believe that the wealth of a country lies in how much silver and gold a country held. So trade was became a means for countries to obtain these precious metals. And well, as you can imagine, with this logic, then countries prefer to sell, to export, than import, right? Because when you export, you get the precious metals in your country. But when you import, since precious metals like gold and silver are the only things others accepted, that means you have to give it up. So it created this weird phenomenon where countries only favored selling and refused to import from anybody, and so it wasn't working very well. Okay, and then some philosophers started thinking about that theory and that way of handling things, and one of them was Adam Smith. Right? Adam Smith started saying, well, what's the whole point of hoarding gold and silver, right? Because it can't help us produce anything. We can't throw it into a machine and it comes out as a beautiful blanket, and you definitely can't eat it during a famine, right? So he started looking at things, and he came up with this idea, said, hey, actually we shouldn't care about how many tons of gold we have and somehow boast that as our strength as a country. Okay, we should really look at how to just trade with other countries with what we have and what we need. But what Adam Smith did not understand was how trade worked. Adam Smith just assumed that trade was based on absolute advantage. Right? He said, hey, if we can make more of something, we should sell it. Right? If we can make less of something else than another country, we should buy it from them. Now, that was already an improvement on trade theory compared to mercantilism, but then after Adam Smith, another guy named David Ricardo came along, and David Ricardo started saying, well, maybe it's not about how much we can make in one thing and versus how little we can make in something else, but rather it's whether we're different or not, right? So as long as we're different, as long as instead of looking at the absolute cost of how much it takes to make something, but what we're giving up in what we could have done with the same resources, right? Well, nowadays we call that opportunity cost. He's saying as long as we have a different opportunity cost, we should trade with somebody, right? So that's why this model that we kind of talked about last time and the one that we continue to talk about in this chapter is called the Ricardian model. The Ricardian model is the fundamental model for modern day trade theory. Okay, so that's kind of where it all got started, and that's what this chapter is about. Okay, now the one of the questions is about the assumptions of the Ricardian model. Your book has a nice list. Make sure you look at it and see some of these assumptions will not seem realistic to you. Okay. For example, one of the assumptions is that there's no transportation cost, and another one says we have perfectly competitive markets, and we know that that's not the case. However, that does not mean this model does not have any merit, right? So first of all, it was groundbreaking and established the modern day trade theory, but second of all, even though some of these assumptions seem less realistic, other principles still explain a lot of trade patterns even till this day. And as we move on, we will start relaxing these assumptions and saying, well, when the market, for example, is not perfectly competitive, how does trade work, right? So this is a starting point, okay? And make sure you read about the setup and the foundations of this model. Now, questions. Some of the questions on this discussion sheet or this summary sheet that I'm asking you to answer, we already answered during our last class, right? For example, 5, 6, and 7, 8. These are all questions we answered last time, right? So, we looked at PPF and how to find comparative advantage that way. The marginal rate of transformation, okay, question number 6 here, that is the name for the slope of your PPF, right? Last time we talked about the slope is your opportunity cost of your horizontal product, your product on your horizontal axis. And I forgot to point out that it has an official name called the marginal rate of transformation, right? It's how much you can transform one product into another, right? We call that opportunity cost, okay? And so the harder part of this chapter, okay, is going to be with the increasing costs type of conditions and look at how trade works, okay? But before we look at that, okay, one thing I want to point out is one of the questions asks you about, other than consumption gains, what are some dynamic gains from trade, right? Dynamic means changing over time, and so those are things that are that come after we consider just the fact that we can consume above our PPF, like we showed last time with our Brazil and U.S. making airplanes example. But these dynamic gains can be the fact that, well, now we have more production and more consumption, so that means higher income and higher utilities, and higher income and higher production, or productivity I should say, can then lead to more resources for future production and economic growth, right? So these are the kind of dynamic gains from trade that we're talking about, right? So other things can be, as you specialize, you can develop economies of scale and increase your competition and causing higher quality of products and etc. Right? So those are all kind of secondary effects from trade. Okay. Now let's look at the kind of core of this chapter, which is, well, last time we said PPFs are not straight lines usually, right? They're curved lines. They represent specialized resources that cannot be freely changed from product to product at a fixed rate. Okay, so when that's the case, how does trade work? Is trade still beneficial? And if so, how do we show it? Right. So let's look at an example. I'm just making things up as we go. Right. So let's say U.S. and China are trading two things. Okay, and let's say that we both make, I don't know, let's find a current example, right? So let's say we both make 3M or N95 masks, okay? Let's not assign any brand. Let's just say N95 masks. These are the masks that healthcare professionals are in desperate need for. And then we also make ventilators, right? Okay, and if I'm spelling ventilators wrong, I'm pulling them Chinese card, so you know, at least I have that card. Okay, now clearly, right, what works for N95 masks are not going to work perfectly for ventilators. I'm sure some resources they can share, like filters and etc., but most resources are going to be specialized. So that means these the PPF between these two products are going to be curved. Right. Now, N95 masks are simpler, okay, not as sophisticated than ventilators. So let's say if we look at the production of both of these products in the U.S. versus China, okay. So let's say the U.S. curve looks something like this, okay, where we clearly have a compared advantage in ventilators. And in China, their production is not as sophisticated, so their strength lies in N95 masks. Okay, and let's say that initially, okay, both countries, for simplicity, let's say produced right here. Okay, call this point A, and point A is let's say 100 million N95 masks, and maybe 10,000 ventilators a year. Okay, again, I'm just making these things up. So this is saying this is before trade. Okay, I should point out this is before trade. So before trade, both countries are producing the same quantities on their own PPF, right? And I picked this quantity just because it simply exists on both PPF, so we don't have to keep track of different points. So it's just for simplicity. Now let's say that, well, because of this world pandemic taught us a lesson, we're actually setting aside our petty differences, and we decide, hey, let's pull resources together to make sure we all have enough medical supplies to go around before this fall if this virus comes and to hit us again. So we decided to come together and trade. That means we're going to specialize in what we have the compared advantage in, right? Last time we said, well, your slope of your PPF, okay, so this is the US one, and this is the Chinese one, right? So we said the slope of your PPF, or the marginal rate of transformation, is the opportunity cost for your production, right? So at point A, you can see for the U.S., okay, the slope is going to be the slope of this line, okay, which means you have a very steep slope. That means we have to give up a lot of ventilators for a few N95 masks. For China, however, their slope is going to be on this tangent line. Okay, pretend it's perfectly tangent there. So China's slope is very flat, and that means when they make a whole bunch of N95s, they only give up a little bit of ventilators. Okay, so clearly then China has the compared advantage in N95 masks, right? Because when they make one N95 mask at point A, they're only giving up a little bit of ventilators. But when the U.S. at point A is making one N95 mask, we have to give up a huge decrease vertically. So we have a huge rise, negative rise for a little bit of run increase, right? So we don't have the compared advantage in N95 masks. And last time we said if we don't have the N95 mask comparative advantage, then we know we have the ventilator comparative advantage. So if we do come together and trade, then according to our trade theory, these two countries should specialize. That means the US is going to start making more ventilators and China should start making more N95 masks. Well, in the constant cost framework where we had straight lines, that meant you just took your production all the way to the maximum, right? The US would only make ventilators and China would only make N95 masks. So we would go here and China would go here and then would come together to trade. However, that does not work in this framework, okay? Because here, as we start to move toward more ventilators, toward more specialization in ventilators, what's going to happen to our opportunity costs? Okay, well, as we make more and more ventilators, our opportunity cost of ventilators on this curve, like we demonstrated last time, is going to start increasing more and more. Okay, it's going to cost us more and more N95 masks to make ventilators. And then as China moves toward N95 mask specialization, their opportunity cost is going to continue to increase for N95 masks. So eventually, if we keep pushing, we could get to a point where the US would lose ventilator comparative advantage because our opportunity cost for ventilators has grown higher than China's, because as China moves more toward N95 masks, their N95 mask opportunity cost will become higher and higher, which means their ventilator opportunity cost is going to become lower and lower, right? So as our ventilator opportunity cost increases and theirs decreases, then we can flip the opportunity cost, or I should say we can flip the comparative advantage. And we don't want that to happen, right? So we cannot push too far on our curve, because we cannot go to the endpoints right here and then trade, because by then we will have reversed the comparative advantage. So where do we stop then? Well, we should push up along our curve, okay, right until we are about to lose our comparative advantage. Then we stop, right? Because if we produce any more, we're going to be losing comparative advantage, so we don't go that far. And China will continue to increase on their curve and stop right before they lose their comparative advantage in N95 masks, okay? So well, how do we find those magical points? It's actually fairly easy. Okay, what you do is to find one common tangent line for both PPFs. So what I mean is there's going to be one straight line that lies tangent against both PPFs. Okay, so I am going to try to see if I can hit it right. It's tricky on the screen, but let's suppose that we have, oh, it's not working. Hold on. I'm trying to use use an actual pencil to line up and to draw a straight line here. No, don't want to do that. Okay. Okay, bear with me. I have to hold a pencil down without touching the screen so my Apple Pencil will work. Why is it not working? Oh, it is working there. Okay, sorry, one more try. Let's see if this still fails. I'm going to just draw it without any help. Okay, it's not going to let me do it, so I'm going to just draw it by eyeballing it. Right, so let's say there's a straight line that somehow goes like this. Okay. Now, you can see that it lies tangent right here against the US curve, and it lies tangent right here against the Chinese curve. So, that is then where we specialize to. Okay, so we will go from point A, call this point B. Okay, China will go from point A to point C, and then we stop. And this blue line is what our consumption possibilities can be after we start trading. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go to point B where we'll produce, again, these are just arbitrary numbers, they don't matter. So let's say we'll go to 25,000 ventilators, and we'll reduce our N95 masks to 60 million. Okay, and China, on the other hand, will go to where they only make 5,000 ventilators instead of 10, but they increase their N95 production to 25 million, right? And then we come together and trade because at point B and point C, we have the same slope on both curves. So that means our opportunity costs of N95 masks and ventilators now equal each other in both countries. If we were to push any further than that, we reverse the comparative advantage, and that doesn't make sense. So we stop right there. And then we come together and trade. The U.S. will sell some of our 25,000 ventilators to China in exchange for some of their 25 million N95 masks. Okay, and now, like I mentioned already, this blue line is our new consumption possibilities. The question then is, well, where on the blue line are we going to end up? Well, then that depends on where our indifference curve is, right? So remember, we want to find that magical indifference curve that lies tangent, to our consumption capacities here, right? So if this is our indifference curve and it touches right here, okay, then this is how much we're going to consume. So call this point D. Point D can be our consumption point for USA, okay? Now you can see point D clearly lies above our own PPF, so again, we are still better off, okay? We are consuming at a point that is higher than our curve, and then China, of course, will be on the same blue line, so China is consuming above their own PPF as well. So both countries are still better off. The key difference here, is that we no longer completely specialize, right? We did not go to the endpoints like the straight line case. Instead, we went to point B, China went to point C. That means, yeah, we produced 25,000 ventilators, but we also produced 60 million N95 masks. We did not go to zero on that production. And China, on the other hand, went to 25 million N95 masks, but they did not go to zero on ventilators. They still made 5,000 because we did not want to push beyond our comparative advantage. So this is what we call partial specialization. And this is how curved PPFs, or the official name for it is increasing cost conditions, work with trade. Okay, so you partially specialize until you have identical opportunity costs, which is found by having one straight line lying tangent to both curves, and then you trade somewhere in the middle, which is a section of the consumption curve that lies above your PPF, making you better off. And where you trade on that curve depends on what your preference is, where your indifference curve is, and you find the one that lies tangent to that. That's the maximum utility you can receive from that consumption, and that's how much we're going to consume, and thus dictates how much we're going to trade. All right, so I hope that makes sense. And this is something, a graph like this, minus the numbers I put on there, is something I expect you to be able to draw and analyze and tell me what's going on, right? You should be able to tell me, okay, if we were to start at A and then come together to trade, explain how you determine the comparative advantage, and then tell me how you find out you will specialize to B and China will specialize to C, and then how we benefit by consuming on that blue line, which lies above our PPFs, and how the optimal consumption is determined, which is by putting the indifference curve tangent to that blue line, the consumption possibilities. Now, I expect you to be able to do all this, and you can count on having a question like this on your test or take home your supplemental homework, because this is Econ 358, so a key difference that you should understand is what you need to be able to do. In Econ 100 level classes, your job is to learn how to identify the correct answer. But in this case, you need to be able to um, repeat what you learn in class on your own, right? So that means not only you need to identify the correct answer, you need to be able to repeat what I have shown you. Okay, so that's a key difference I think a lot of people don't understand and struggle with, because if you don't put in enough practice to understand and be able to repeat this graph on your own and do the analysis on your own, you're not going to meet the expected level of knowledge for this class, right? Now, of course, you might think, oh man, this is too much to ask. It's not, right? It's a junior level class, and at least you're not going to ever reach the graduate level in your undergrad, right? Because in graduate level, what's going to happen is that you will learn something like this, and then you will see a completely new question with a model similar to this, but with some key differences that you have never seen, and you will be expected to do analysis on something brand new based on some past knowledge that you learned in class, right? So your exams in grad school will never be about what you have learned. It's about using what you have learned to solve something you have never seen before. So that's the different levels you should escalate to if you move on. But I wanted to explain that key difference to you guys in this video, since this is very early on in this semester. So this is one of the several models that we will talk about, and I expect you to be able to draw a graph like this, do the same analysis I just did, and explain it in words as well of what just happened, right? Not just draw the graphs, but tell me what was going on. Okay. All right, so this is the hardest part of this chapter. Okay, again, if you have questions, make sure you write it down, and we'll talk about it on Wednesday. Okay. All right, then the rest of these questions on your from this chapter, we'll address some of them, and then we'll call it good for today. And the impacts on jobs, through trade. The key difference, the key thing to remember is that we have different industries that get impacted differently, right? For what we call import competing industries, trade is bad because they compete with foreign producers, and that means when we open up trade, they lose jobs, okay? But for exporting industries, these are the industries that we have comparative advantage in, and they'll be able to not only sell domestically but also abroad, so they'll actually have increases in jobs. So one thing that you should keep in mind is not to fall for the sob stories you hear on the media, right? Because oftentimes the media, for different purposes, like to portray sob stories, right? You hear story where they say, this is Joe, right? Joe has been working in Montana for the same mill for 35 years, and because of now we have cheaper imported Canadian lumber, Joe just lost his job. And well, Joe also just got diagnosed with cancer, and now he has no money to treat it, and his kids can no longer afford to go to college, so they just dropped out and joined the military, right? And it's all because of evil Canadian lumber. And we listen to that, and we're like, man, yeah, Canadian lumber is bad. We better not buy it from Canada anymore, right? And that is, while that is completely true, and we do feel terrible for Joe and for his trials, but by using Joe as the only evidence to point to the fact that trade is bad, is definitely biased, right? Because by looking at Joe only, you're ignoring John, because John used to be, this lazy kid that was not going to amount to anything, but then he found a passion in coding, went to school, learned about it, and found a job in Google, and now he makes well into six figures, right? So that's because Google has some of the products that's sold all over the world, and without trade, John probably would never have had that chance. So trade impacts different industries differently, and we cannot focus on just one side to say it's only good or only bad. So keep that in mind, okay? And then the next thing I want to address is, well, how does comparative advantage work with many products, right? Because here all the examples we looked at are just two products. Easy. If you have one comparative advantage in one, then they have comparative advantage in the other. But what if two countries trade 100 different things? Well, by the nature of comparative advantage, I should say opportunity cost, you can always compare the opportunity cost of the same good with the two different producers. So when you have multiple products, you can actually then just have this different ordering of comparative advantage, right? So maybe again this is U.S. and this is China, and this is who has comparative advantage in what. So maybe here we have microchips, okay, and then they have comparative advantage in textile. And then, a little bit more for the U.S. is maybe, I don't know, auto cars. So it's auto driving cars, right? So self-driving cars. And then China, the next one, let's say it could be, whoops, where did it go? Oh, there it is. So China, the next one, maybe, traditional cars. Okay. And then maybe we find things in the middle. Okay, so the point is you can look at this and say, okay, who has comparative advantage in what, and there's going to be this ordering of different products of who has more comparative advantage and then less in others. And then the tricky part is, well, where is the cutoff, right? Where can you say, okay, China is exporting 4 out of these 8 products, or 7 out of these 8 products. So where do we cut it off and say, okay, here's how trade breaks down? Well, that depends on the international demand, right? So if the international demand lies right in the middle, then we cut it in the middle. If the international demand, pushes the production for China higher right here, then China would produce right there, and the U.S. would produce only microchips and self-driving cars. Right? So, but the point is, you can still create this ordering for multiple products based on how you calculate opportunity costs. Okay, and well, the next question is, well, what if you have multiple countries, right? How does our comparative advantage works in that scenario? Well, trade is always going to be binary, right? So you can have several trade partners, but when it comes to negotiating trade, it's still just you and Germany, you and England, you and China, and then they can go negotiate with China on their own for their own strengths. So even though you can trade with many countries at the end, you still just look at 2 at a time. So our principles totally work, right? So we can totally sell microchips to China, and then China can sell textile to Germany, and then Germany can sell us, robots, and then we can have this triangle going. But that does not change how trade works and how comparative advantage works. Okay, and then finally, or not finally, the next thing I want to address is exit barriers. Okay, exit barriers refer to the difficulty industries sometimes face before they can call it quit. And a lot of times this is because of the enormous amount of fixed cost that they already put down and how specialized their resources are, so they can't get rid of them very easily. So, for example, in Utah, where BYU is, by Utah Lake, there used to be a Geneva Steel. The steel industry in the U.S. has died a long time ago, but, well, I should say has lost their comparative advantage decades ago, but there are still some factories that exist because, well, first of all, we don't completely specialize in what we have a comparative advantage in and not produce any steel at all. But second of all, it's because, well, these steel plants often face at least hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment and special, ovens that heat up metal, etc. And that cannot be used for anything else. Okay, and so for them to quit, they need to liquidate as much capital as possible in order to, to cover their cost. But when you have $500 million in this one factory, you cannot sell it to anybody because nobody else can use this, right? Because Google can never buy a steel plant and then somehow say, hey, let's use this super awesome oven just for heating, right? It'll never happen. So that forces companies to continue to produce to minimize their loss. And so sometimes, even though we have complete comparative disadvantage in something like steel, it won't die for a long, long time because of exit barriers. So that can affect how trade can impact our markets. Okay, and then last thing I want to talk about is outsourcing. Your book talks about outsourcing and pros and cons. So the bottom line I want you to remember is to analyze the impact on costs for the producers and then their quantity and prices that they can produce and how that also impact consumers, right? So yes, it does cause job loss in that factor, in that industry when a company shifts their jobs abroad. That's what outsourcing means, okay? But that also means they can then lower their cost, which means they can lower their prices, which means consumers can purchase more. And also there have been a lot of studies to show that actually better jobs will come to America and eventually, right? Because as consumers demand more quantities from these companies, then even though their plants are now outside of the nation, usually management jobs are still for Americans. They send Americans to manage these plants. So as their production expands, then better jobs get created for Americans. So there's actually not a whole lot of evidence supporting the fact that outsourcing kills jobs, right? It just displaces bad jobs for better ones. But anyway, so I did not hit everything, but I hit all the key things in this chapter. The rest you can easily read and hopefully understand. If not, please don't feel bad. Just write down your questions and let's talk about it next week. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy studying and learning these topics. The first 3 chapters or so are really, really dry. After that, it gets more interesting because we have to lay down the historical and theory background before we can talk about applications more. So bear with me for a couple weeks, and then we'll have a lot more examples to talk about and etc. But this is chapter 2, so I hope you've taken breaks and took time to understand these things and digest them. And I will see you on Wednesday. Okay?